In social psychology, a stereotype is a thought that can be adopted about specific types of individuals as certain ways of doing things. These thoughts or beliefs may or may not accurately reflect reality. However, this is only a fundamental psychological definition of a stereotype. Within psychology and spanning across other disciplines, there are different conceptualizations and theories of stereotyping that provide their own expanded definition. Some of these definitions share commonalities, though each one may also harbor unique aspects that may contradict the others. Etymology. The term stereotype derives from the Greek words sigma tau epsilon rho epsilon omicron sigma therm solid, and tau epsilon pi omicron sigma impression, hence, solid impression on one or more idea theory. The term comes from the printing trade and was first adopted in 1798 by Firm and Didot to describe a printing plate that duplicated any typography. The duplicate printing plate, or the stereotype, is used for printing instead of the original. Outside of printing, the first reference to stereotype was in 1850, as a noun that meant image perpetuated without change. However, it was not until 1922 that stereotype was first used in the modern psychological sense by American journalist Walter Lippmann in his work Public Opinion. Relationship with other types of intergroup attitudes. Stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination are understood as related but different concepts. Stereotypes are regarded as the most cognitive component and often occurs without conscious awareness, whereas prejudice is the affective component of stereotyping and discrimination is one of the behavioral components of prejudicial reactions. In this tripartite view of intergroup attitudes, stereotypes reflect expectations and beliefs about the characteristics of members of groups perceived as different from one's own. Prejudice represents the emotional response, and discrimination refers to actions. Although related, the three concepts can exist independently of each other. According to Daniel Katz and Kenneth Braley, stereotyping leads to racial prejudice when people emotionally react to the name of a group, ascribe characteristics to members of that group, and then evaluate those characteristics. Possible prejudicial effects of stereotypes are justification of ill-founded prejudices or ignorance, unwillingness to rethink one's attitudes and behavior towards stereotyped groups, preventing some people of stereotyped groups from entering or succeeding in activities or fields. Content. Stereotype content refers to the attributes that people think characterize a group. Studies of stereotype content examine what people think of others, rather than the reasons and mechanisms involved in stereotyping. Early theories of stereotype content proposed by social psychologists such as Gordon Allport assumed that stereotypes of outgroups reflected uniform antipathy. For instance, Katz and Braley argued in their classic 1933 study that ethnic stereotypes were uniformly negative. By contrast, a newer model of stereotype content theorizes that stereotypes are frequently ambivalent and vary along two dimensions: warmth and competence. Warmth and competence are respectively predicted by lack of competition and status. Groups that do not compete with the in-group for the same resources are perceived as warm, whereas high-status groups are considered competent. The groups within each of the four combinations of high and low levels of warmth and competence elicit distinct emotions. The model explains the phenomenon that some out-groups are admired but disliked, whereas others are liked but disrespected. This model was empirically tested on a variety of national and international samples and was found to reliably predict stereotype content. Functions. Early studies suggested that stereotypes were only used by rigid, repressed, and authoritarian people. This idea has been refuted by contemporary studies that suggest the ubiquity of stereotypes, and it was suggested to regard stereotypes as collective, group beliefs, meaning that people who belong to the same social group share the same set of stereotypes. Modern research asserts that full understanding of stereotypes requires considering them from two complementary perspectives, as shared within a particular culture, subculture, and as formed in the mind of an individual person. Relationship between cognitive and social functions. Stereotyping can serve cognitive functions on an interpersonal level and social functions on an intergroup level. For stereotyping to function on an intergroup level, an individual must see themselves as part of a group, and being part of that group must also be salient for the individual. Craig McGarty, Russell Spears, and Vincent Y. Iserbeet argued that the cognitive functions of stereotyping are best understood in relation to its social functions, and vice versa. Cognitive functions stereotypes can help make sense of the world. They are a form of categorization that helps to simplify and systematize information. Thus, information is more easily identified, recalled, predicted, and reacted to. Stereotypes are categories of objects or people. Between stereotypes, objects or people are as different from each other as possible. Within stereotypes, objects or people are as similar to each other as possible. Gordon Allport has suggested possible answers to why people find it easier to understand, categorize information. First, people can consult a category to identify response patterns. Second, categorized information is more specific than non-categorized information, as categorization accentuates properties that are shared by all members of a group. Third, people can readily describe objects in a category because objects in the same category have distinct characteristics. Finally, people can take for granted the characteristics of a particular category because the category itself may be an arbitrary grouping. A complementary perspective theorizes how stereotypes function as time and energy savers that allow people to act more efficiently. Yet another perspective suggests that stereotypes are people's biased perceptions of the social contexts. In this view, people use stereotypes as shortcuts to make sense of the social contexts, and this makes a person's task of understanding his or her world less cognitively demanding. Social functions, social categorization. In the following situations, the overarching purpose of stereotyping is for people to put the collective self in a positive light. When stereotypes are used for explaining social events. When stereotypes are used for justifying activities of one's own group to another group. When stereotypes are used for differentiating the in-group as positively distinct from out-groups. Explanation purposes. As mentioned previously, stereotypes can be used to explain social events. Henry Tadgeful described his observations of how some people found that the anti-Semitic contents of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion only made sense if Jews have certain characteristics. Therefore, according to Tadgeful, Jews were stereotyped as being evil and yearning for world domination to match the anti-Semitic facts as presented in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Justification purposes. People create stereotypes of an out-group to justify the actions that their in-group has committed towards that out-group. For example, according to Tadgeful, Europeans stereotype Turkish, Indian, and Chinese people as being incapable of achieving financial advances without European help. This stereotype was used to justify European colonialism in Turkey, India, and China. Intergroup differentiation. An assumption is that people want their in-group to have a positive image relative to outgroups, and so people want to differentiate their in-group from relevant outgroups in a desirable way. If an outgroup does not affect the in-group's image, then from an image preservation point of view, there is no point for the in-group to be positively distinct from that outgroup. People can actively create certain images for relevant outgroups by stereotyping. People do so when they see that their in-group is no longer as clearly and/or as positively differentiated from relevant outgroups, and they want to restore the intergroup differentiation to a state that favors the in-group. Social functions. Self-categorization. People will change the stereotype of their in-groups and out-groups to suit the context they are in. People are likely to self-stereotype their in-group as homogeneous in an intergroup context, and they are less likely to do so in an intragroup context where the need to emphasize the group membership is not as great. Stereotypes can emphasize a person's group membership in two steps. First, stereotypes emphasize the person's similarities with in-group members on relevant dimensions, and also the person's differences from out-group members on relevant dimensions. Second, the more the stereotypes emphasize within-group similarities and between-group differences, the more salient the person's social identity will become, and the more depersonalized that person will be. A depersonalized person will abandon his/her individual differences and embrace the stereotypes associated with his/her relevant group membership. Social functions. Social influence and consensus. Stereotypes are an indicator of in-group consensus. When there are intragroup disagreements over stereotypes of the in-group and/or out-groups, in-group members will take collective action to prevent other in-group members from diverging from each other. John C. Turner proposed in 1987 that if in-group members disagree on an out-group stereotype, then one of three possible collective actions will follow. First, in-group members may negotiate with each other and conclude that they have different out-group stereotypes because they are stereotyping different subgroups of an out-group. Second, in-group members may negotiate with each other, but conclude that they are disagreeing because of categorical differences amongst themselves. Accordingly, in this context, it is better to categorize in-group members under different categories than under a shared category. Finally, in-group members may influence each other to arrive at a common out-group stereotype. Formation. Different disciplines give different accounts of how stereotypes develop. Psychologists may focus on an individual's experience with groups, patterns of communication about those groups, and intergroup conflict. As for sociologists, they may focus on the relations among different groups in a social structure. They suggest that stereotypes are the result of conflict, poor parenting, and inadequate mental and emotional development. Once stereotypes have formed, there are two main factors that explain the persistence. First, the cognitive effects of schematic processing make it so that when a member of a group behaves as we expect, the behavior confirms and even strengthens existing stereotypes. Second, the affective or emotional aspects of prejudice render logical arguments against stereotypes ineffective in countering the power of emotional responses. Correspondence bias. The correspondence bias refers to the tendency to ascribe a person's behavior to her or his disposition or personality, and to underestimate the extent to which situational factors elicited the behavior. The correspondence bias can play an important role in stereotype formation. For example, in a study by Roger and Iserbeet, participants watched a video showing students who were randomly instructed to find arguments either for or against euthanasia. The students that argued in favor of euthanasia came from the same law department or from different departments. Results showed that participants attributed the students' responses to their attitudes, although it had been made clear in the video that students had no choice about their position. Participants reported that group membership, i.e., the department that the students belonged to, affected the students' opinions about euthanasia. Law students were perceived to be more in favor of euthanasia than students from different departments, despite the fact that a pretest had revealed that subjects had no pre-existing expectations about attitudes toward euthanasia and the department that students belonged to. The attribution error created the new stereotype that law students are more likely to support euthanasia. Nia et al. Found that people who tend to draw dispositional inferences from behavior and ignore situational constraints are more likely to stereotype low-status groups as incompetent and high-status groups as competent. Participants listened to descriptions of two fictitious groups of Pacific Islanders, one of which was described as being higher in status than the other. In a second study, subjects rated actual groups, the poor and wealthy, women and men, in the United States in terms of their competence. Subjects who scored high on the measure of correspondence by stereotyped the poor, women, and the fictitious lower-status Pacific Islanders as incompetent, whereas they stereotyped the wealthy, men, and the high-status Pacific Islanders as competent. The correspondence bias was a significant predictor of stereotyping even after controlling for other measures that have been linked to beliefs about low-status groups. The just world hypothesis and social dominance orientation. Illusory correlation research has shown that stereotypes can develop based on a cognitive mechanism known as illusory correlation, an erroneous inference about the relationship between two events. If two events which are statistically infrequent co-occur, observers overestimate the frequency of co-occurrence of these events. The underlying reason is that rare, infrequent events are distinctive and salient and, when paired, become even more so. The heightened salience results in more attention and more effective encoding, which strengthens the belief that the events are correlated. In the intergroup context, illusory correlations lead people to misattribute rare behaviors or traits at higher rates to minority group members than to majority groups, even when both display the same proportion of the behaviors or traits. Black people, for instance, are a minority group in the United States, and interaction with blacks is a relatively infrequent event for an average white American. Similarly, undesirable behavior is statistically less frequent than desirable behavior. Since both events, blackness and undesirable behavior, are distinctive in the sense that they are infrequent, the combination of the two leads observers to overestimate the rate of co-occurrence. Similarly, in workplaces where women are underrepresented and negative behaviors such as errors occur less frequently than positive behaviors, women become more strongly associated with mistakes than men. In a landmark study, David Hamilton and Richard Gifford examined the role of illusory correlation in stereotype formation. Subjects were instructed to read descriptions of behaviors performed by members of groups A and B. Negative behaviors outnumbered positive actions and Group B was smaller than Group A, making negative behaviors and membership in Group B relatively infrequent and distinctive. Participants were then asked who had performed a set of actions, a person of Group A or Group B. Results showed that subjects overestimated the frequency with which both distinctive events, membership in Group B and negative behavior, co-occurred, and evaluated Group B more negatively. This despite the fact the proportion of positive to negative behaviors was equivalent for both groups and that there was no actual correlation. between group membership and behaviors. Although Hamilton and Gifford found a similar effect for positive behaviors as the infrequent events, a meta-analytic review of studies showed that illusory correlation effects are stronger when the infrequent, distinctive information is negative. Hamilton and Gifford's distinctiveness-based explanation of stereotype formation was subsequently extended. A 1994 study by McConnell, Sherman, and Hamilton found that people formed stereotypes based on information that was not distinctive at the time of presentation, but was considered distinctive at the time of judgment. Once a person judges non-distinctive information in memory to be distinctive, that information is re-encoded and re-represented as if it had been distinctive when it was first processed. Common environment. One explanation for why stereotypes are shared is that they are the result of a common environment that stimulates people to react in the same way. The problem with the common environment explanation in general is that it does not explain how shared stereotypes can occur without direct stimuli. Research since the 1930s suggested that people are highly similar with each other in how they describe different racial and national groups, although those people have no personal experience with the groups they are describing. Socialization and upbringing. Another explanation says that people are socialized to adopt the same stereotypes. Some psychologists believe that although stereotypes can be absorbed at any age, stereotypes are usually acquired in early childhood under the influence of parents, teachers, peers, and the media. If stereotypes are defined by social values, then stereotypes will only change as per changes in social values. The suggestion that stereotype content depend on social values reflects Walter Lippmann's argument in his 1922 publication that stereotypes are rigid, because they cannot be changed at will. Studies emerging since the 1940s refuted the suggestion that stereotype contents cannot be changed at will. Those studies suggested that one group's stereotype of another group would become more or less positive depending on whether their intergroup relationship had improved or degraded. Intergroup events often changed intergroup relationships. For example, after World War II, Black American students held a more negative stereotype of people from countries that were the United States' World War II enemies. If there are no changes to an intergroup relationship, then relevant stereotypes will not change. Intergroup relations. According to a third explanation, shared stereotypes are neither caused by the coincidence of common stimuli, nor by socialization. This explanation posits that stereotypes are shared because group members are motivated to behave in certain ways, and stereotypes reflect those behaviors. It is important to note from this explanation that stereotypes are the consequence, not the cause, of intergroup relations. This explanation assumes that when it is important for people to acknowledge both their in-group and out-group, then those people will aim to emphasize the difference from out-group members, and the similarity to in-group members. Activation. The dual process model of cognitive processing of stereotypes asserts that automatic activation of stereotypes is followed by a controlled processing stage, during which an individual may choose to disregard or ignore the stereotyped information that has been brought to mind. A number of studies have found that stereotypes are activated automatically. Patricia Devine, for example, suggested that stereotypes are automatically activated in the presence of a member of a stereotyped group, and that the unintentional activation of the stereotype is equally strong for high and low prejudice persons. Words related to the cultural stereotype of blacks were presented subliminally during an ostensibly unrelated impression formation task. Subjects read a paragraph describing a race specified target person's behaviors and rated the target person on several trait scales. Results showed that participants who received a high proportion of racial words rated the target person in the story as significantly more hostile than participants who were presented with a lower proportion of words related to the stereotype. This effect held true for both high and low prejudice subjects. Thus, the racial stereotype was activated even for low prejudice individuals who did not personally endorse it. Studies using alternative priming methods have shown that the activation of gender and age stereotypes can also be automatic. Subsequent research suggested that the relation between category activation and stereotype activation was more complex. Lepore and Brown, for instance, noted that the words used in Devine's study were both neutral category labels and stereotypic attributes. They argued that if only the neutral category labels were presented, people high and low in prejudice would respond differently. In a design similar to Devine's, Lepore and Brown primed the category of African Americans using labels such as blacks and West Indians, and then assessed the differential activation of the associated stereotype in the subsequent impression formation task. They found that high prejudice participants increased the ratings of the target person on the negative stereotypic dimensions and decreased them on the positive dimension, whereas low prejudice subjects tended in the opposite direction. The results suggest that the level of prejudice and stereotype endorsement affects people's judgments when the category, and not the stereotype, per se, is primed. Research has shown that people can be trained to activate counter-stereotypic information and thereby reduce the automatic activation of negative stereotypes. In a study by Kawakami et al., for example, participants were presented with a category label and taught to respond no to stereotypic traits and yes to non-stereotypic traits. After this training period, subjects showed reduced stereotype activation. This effect is based on the learning of new and more positive stereotypes rather than the negation of already existing ones. Automatic behavioral outcomes. Empirical evidence suggests that stereotype activation can automatically influence social behavior. For example, Bug, Chen, and Burroughs activated the stereotype of the elderly among half of the participants by administering a scrambled sentence test where participants saw words related to age stereotypes. Subjects primed with the stereotype walked significantly more slowly than the control group, thus acting in a way that the stereotype suggests that elderly people will act. In another experiment, Bug, Chen, and Burroughs also found that because the stereotype about blacks includes the notion of aggression, subliminal exposure to black faces increased the likelihood that randomly selected white college students reacted with more aggression and hostility than participants who subconsciously viewed a white face. Similarly, Corral et al. Showed that activated stereotypes about blacks can influence people's behavior. In a series of experiments, black and white participants played a video game, in which a black and white person was shown holding a gun or a harmless object. Participants had to decide as quickly as possible whether to shoot the target when the target person was armed. Both black and white participants were faster in deciding to shoot the target when he was black than when he was white. When the target was unarmed, the participants avoided shooting him more quickly when he was white. Time pressure made the shooter bias even more pronounced.